Spilling red wine on a Russian mob boss usually ended careers. Sometimes it ended lives. The night Juniper Hadley did it, it merely ended the awkward silence that had been suffocating the private dining room of the most exclusive restaurant in Chicago for the better part of 40 minutes. She weighed 280 pounds, owned exactly one pair of black slacks that didn't have a small bleach stain near the left knee, and had somehow, completely by accident, become the only person in 4 years to make Nikolai Sorokin laugh. The private dining room at Aurelius was not a place where things went wrong. Executive chef Damien Price had spent 11 years cultivating a space where every napkin fold was symmetrical, every wine pour was measured to the milliliter, and every server moved through the room like a ghost, present but invisible. The restaurant occupied the entire 42nd floor of the Vantage Tower in the Loop, with floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out over Lake Michigan like God's own picture window. The kind of place where people didn't speak above a murmur, where deals worth more than most countries' GDP were conducted over plates of food too beautiful to eat. Nikolai Sorokin held his standing reservation in the east corner every Thursday. He had for 3 years. The staff knew his order before he sat down. Seared duck, a specific bottle of 2009 Burgundy that Aurelius kept in a locked case specifically for him, and absolute uninterrupted silence from the moment he walked through the door to the moment he left. He was 42 years old, with broad shoulders built for expensive wool, and the kind of face that had once been handsome in a sharp, angular way before life had carved something harder into it. Silver had crept into his dark hair at the temples. He wore a watch that cost more than Juniper's college debt, which was saying something, because her college debt was catastrophic. Nobody who worked the private dining room knew the details of what Nikolai Sorokin actually did. They just knew that the restaurant manager, a normally unflappable Frenchman named Philippe, went visibly pale every time Sorokin's reservation appeared on the calendar. They knew that the 2 large men who waited outside the dining room door were not sommeliers. They knew that the restaurant had quietly settled a lawsuit the year before when a careless busboy had bumped Sorokin's chair without apologizing, and had subsequently declared that his entire extended family's visa status had been reviewed by federal immigration within the week. He was not a man you spilled wine on. Juniper Hadley was not supposed to be working that room. She was supposed to be covering the main floor, table 12, a bachelorette party that tipped in cash and kept ordering champagne. But Danny, the regular private dining server, had slipped on a wet tile in the employee bathroom 20 minutes before service, and was currently sitting with her ankle, iced and elevated in the break room, texting her boyfriend and looking sorry for herself. Juniper had been the only server available with a clean uniform and a current food handling certification. Philippe had looked at her for a long, painful moment. "You understand," he said, his accent thickening the way it always did when he was stressed, "that this table is not like other tables." "I've worked fine dining for 6 years, Juniper said. "Fine dining," Philippe repeated, as if the words tasted wrong. He looked at her. She was 26, with a round, open face dusted in freckles, dark brown curls that refused to stay pinned at the back of her head, no matter what she did to them, and 280 pounds distributed across a frame that had never once fit the Aurelius uniform correctly. The white button-down strained across her chest, and the black slacks had the bleach spot that she had been trying to angle away from customers for 2 weeks. "This is not fine dining," Philippe said grimly. "This is something else entirely. Be invisible. Be silent. Pour from the left, clear from the right. Do not make eye contact. Do not speak unless spoken to. And under no circumstances do you offer to Pepper anything. He doesn't want Pepper. He's been asked about Pepper once before, and it was unpleasant for everyone involved." "No Pepper," Juniper confirmed. "Got it." She did not, as it turned out, have it. The first 20 minutes went fine. Nikolai Sorokin sat alone the way he always did on Thursdays and reviewed something on his phone that made the set of his jaw very tense. Juniper moved around the edges of the room with the careful precision of a woman who had spent her entire adult life being aware of exactly how much space she occupied, which was considerable in a world that was not always gracious about it. She poured water without splashing. She presented the bread basket without dropping it. She retreated to the service station and breathed. She was managing it. She was genuinely managing it. The burgundy was the problem. It was an old bottle, and the cork had been pulled cleanly, and Juniper had practiced 1,000 wine pours in her career, but there was a slight unevenness in the floor near the east corner table, the result of some old settling in the building's foundation, a millimeter or two of tilt that was invisible to the eye, but felt apparently directly through the soles of standard-issue restaurant shoes at exactly the wrong moment. Juniper's left foot caught the edge of her own right heel. Her weight shifted, the bottle tipped, and 8 ounces of 2009 Domaine de la Romane Conti Burgundy, which retailed for approximately $4,000 per bottle, arsed through the air in a perfect, horrifying curve and landed directly on the front of Nikolai Sorokin's white dress shirt. The sound Juniper made was not a word. It was more of a noise, a compressed, desperate squeak that came from somewhere in the back of her throat where all her worst fears lived. The dining room went absolutely still. Outside the door, she heard one of the large men shift his weight. Nikolai Sorokin looked down at his shirt. Then he looked up at Juniper. His eyes were the gray of deep water and completely unreadable, and she was suddenly and viscerally aware that she was the only other living person in this room and that the men outside the door were not sommeliers. "I am so sorry," Juniper said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, which surprised her, because internally she was having what she would later describe to her roommate as a complete spiritual departure from her physical body. "I am so sorry. Please let me." She was already reaching for the cloth tucked into her apron, pressing it uselessly against his shirt front, which was already soaked through. "The dry cleaning, I will pay for it. I'll talk to management. I can." "Oh, this is bad. This is so bad." "Stop," Nikolai said. His voice was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that took practice, the kind that didn't need volume to fill a room. Juniper stopped. She stood there with the wine-soaked cloth in her hand and her face the color of a radish and her heart doing something genuinely medically concerning inside her chest. He looked at her for a long moment. The restaurant was so quiet she could hear the city 42 floors below. "What is your name?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. Juniper Hadley. She said it the way she might have given her name to a police officer or a judge. Clearly, because clarity seemed important. "Juniper." He said it the way people always said her name when they heard it for the first time, with a slight pause, tasting the strangeness of it. "Juniper, you are still holding the cloth against my shirt." She looked down. She was, in fact, still pressing the cloth against his chest. She yanked her hand back. "Sorry. I'm sorry. I'm going to stop apologizing." That's not helpful. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. It was barely a movement. Just the faint suggestion of something that, on a different face in a different situation. "Get me another shirt," he said. "There is one in the car. Tell Ivan at the door. He'll know which bag." Juniper nodded so hard her hair clip finally gave up entirely, and her curls fell down around her shoulders in a dark, unruly cascade. She turned and walked, very carefully, because she was not going to fall. She was absolutely not going to fall. Toward the door, behind her she heard a sound, low, brief, unmistakably human. Nikolai Sorokin was laughing. She survived the first dinner. She wasn't fired. Philippe had the expression of a man who had watched a cat walk across a tightrope and couldn't decide whether to be impressed or appalled. But he hadn't fired her. He had moved her back to the main floor the following week. Then Danny quit to move to Portland, and the private dining room had an opening. And somehow, in the way that catastrophically improbable things sometimes become simply ordinary. Juniper Hadley became the Thursday server for Nikolai Sorokin. Nobody quite knew how it happened. Philippe claimed he'd had no other options. The other servers claimed Philippe was losing his mind. Juniper suspected the universe had a very specific sense of humor, and it was almost entirely directed at her. The second Thursday, Nikolai arrived at 7 p.m. precisely, and sat in his east corner and said nothing. Juniper presented the breadbasket without incident. She poured the water without event. She was so careful with the wine that she barely breathed the entire time she was tilting the bottle, and she did not spill a single drop, and when she stepped back to the service station, she allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of private triumph. Then she caught her hip on the corner of the service cart and sent a small ramekin of butter skidding across the cart, off the edge, and directly into the silence of the room. It hit the floor with a noise completely disproportionate to its size. Juniper closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. "Juniper," Nikolai said, from the east corner without looking up from his phone. "Yes?" "The butter. I'll get it. You'll get another one. Don't touch that one." "Right." She got a new ramekin. She placed it on the table with exaggerated care, as if she were handling something radioactive. Then she went back to the service station and quietly said a word that would have gotten her fired on the main floor. But here was the thing about Nikolai Sorokin. On Thursday evenings, he worked. The phone was always out, always lit up, always demanding something. Sometimes men came to the door. The non-sommeliers would step aside and let them pass. And they'd speak to Nikolai in low, fast Russian and leave looking either reassured or terrified, and Juniper would materialize with fresh water, as if she hadn't heard a word of any of it, which was the professional thing to do. Sometimes packages arrived that she was specifically not supposed to look at. One evening a man arrived with what she was fairly certain was a burn on his hand from something that was not a kitchen accident, and Nikolai had looked at him for a long, silent moment and said 2 words in Russian that made the man go the color of old cheese. Juniper refilled his water and retreated to the service station. She had a system. She noticed everything, she processed nothing, and she did her job, which was how she noticed the discrepancy in the invoices. It was an accident, obviously. Everything in her life seemed to begin with that word. Nikolai had stepped away from the table to take a call near the window, something that usually happened around 8:45, and in the process had left a folder of paperwork open on the table. Juniper had been clearing his bread plate and had simply, automatically, looked at the open page the way anyone would look at something sitting directly in their line of sight. It was an invoice, a shipping invoice. Lumber, apparently originating from a Baltic port. She wasn't sure why her brain snagged on it, but she'd spent 2 years after college doing bookkeeping for a small freight company in Bridgeport before she'd moved into restaurant work because the money was better. And numbers had a way of speaking to her, the way music spoke to some people. She glanced at the figures. She glanced again. Somebody was charging Nikolai Sorokin 32% above the regional standard rate on a contract that appeared to have been running for at least 14 months. She put the bread plate down and stepped back to the service station and looked at the wall for a moment. "Is there a problem?" Nikolai asked, from just behind her, close enough that she nearly knocked over the water pitcher she'd been reaching for. "No," she said. And then, because apparently her self-preservation instinct had recently relocated somewhere she couldn't access it. "Actually, yes. Not a service problem. A math problem." He looked at her. "The shipping contract," Juniper said, and pointed at the folder, and then immediately wondered if pointing at a Russian mob boss's private documents was something a person could be arrested for. On the open page. "The Baltic rate. Whoever is billing you for that is overcharging you by almost a third. I might be wrong, rates fluctuate, but the regional benchmark for that route has been..." She named the figure. Precisely. From memory, because it had been her job once to know such things, and her memory for numbers was effectively perfect. The silence in the room was different from the usual kind. Nikolai looked at the open folder. Then he looked at her. "You read my documents. They were open. I looked at them the same way you look at a billboard, passively against my will." Something moved through his expression. Not the almost smile from the first night. Something slower and more considered. He picked up the folder and looked at the page. He took out his phone. "Go back to the service station," he said, and whatever conversation he had after that was in Russian. But the tone of it was very, very calm in the way that certain bodies of water are calm directly before they become very dangerous. When he left that evening, there was an envelope on the table beside his customary tip. The tip was already more than she made in a shift. The envelope contained 4 words on a card with no letterhead. "You should be paid more." She showed it to her roommate when she got home. Her roommate, who worked at a non-profit and had very strong feelings about organized crime in the abstract, stared at it for a long time. "June," she said finally. "I know. You have to quit." "I know," Juniper said, and put the card in the kitchen drawer, and did not quit. By the 6th Thursday, the shift had begun to feel almost natural, which was probably the most alarming thing she could have said about it. The non-sommeliers, whose names she'd learned through careful passive eavesdropping were Bogdan and Taras, had started giving her a curt nod when she passed through the door. She'd accidentally knocked a small decorative plant off the service station ledge on the 4th Thursday. And Bogdan had picked it up without being asked, and placed it back without comment, and she had experienced a warmth toward him that she recognized as deeply irrational. Nikolai himself had begun talking to her. Not much. Not in the casual way of a man making small talk. More like he had a question and she was the nearest available source of an answer. And he had decided at some point between the wine incident and the shipping invoice that she was marginally more reliable than the alternative. He asked what she had studied in college. He asked how long she'd worked at Aurelius. He asked, once, why she had left bookkeeping for restaurant work, and she told him the truth. The freight company had folded. She'd been 3 months behind on rent, and a sign in the window of the restaurant 2 doors down had offered $15 an hour, plus tips and benefits, and she'd walked in the same afternoon. He listened to her the way he read documents, completely without expression, missing nothing. She was beginning to find this completely terrifying in a way that was getting harder and harder to classify as professional discomfort. Then the 8th Thursday arrived, and with it a different kind of trouble. Nikolai was in the east corner when she arrived for her shift, but he was not alone. Across from him sat a man she'd never seen before, heavyset, somewhere in his 50s, with a thick neck and the kind of complexion that suggested his blood pressure was an ongoing emergency. He was sweating faintly. He had the posture of a man who was trying very hard to look relaxed and was not remotely succeeding. She recognized the energy immediately. She had seen it before on 5th Thursdays when men came to the door. This man was either trying to make a deal or trying to get out of one. Possibly both. As she moved to the service station, she did not listen. She was very good at not listening. What she could not help was noticing. The man across from Nikolai, she would later learn his name was Garrity, that he ran a union local on the west side, and that he had been quietly diverting dues money into a private account for 18 months, was sweating so much that his collar had gone dark. Nikolai was sitting with his hands folded on the table in that terrible, still way of his, and speaking very quietly. Juniper was reaching for the water pitcher to do a refill when her apron caught on the edge of the service cart. She had not yet identified this as a recurring structural hazard of the Aurelius private dining room service station setup, though she was beginning to compile the data. The pitch of her weight forward was minimal. She caught herself immediately, but her elbow connected with the water pitcher, which tipped which hit the small glass votive candle on the edge of the cart, which fell with a sound like a small bell. Everyone in the room looked at her. Jerity, whose nerves were already not doing well, flinched so hard he knocked his own wine glass off the table. Juniper watched it fall. She was very close. She moved fast, faster than a person of her size was generally expected to move, which people always seemed surprised by, as if mass and speed were mutually exclusive, and caught it about 8 inches above the floor, wine and all, with both hands, not spilling a drop. The room was quiet. She straightened up. She set the wine glass back on the table. She looked at it to confirm it was stable. Then she looked up. Nikolai was watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Jerity looked like he might be reconsidering every decision he'd ever made. "Sorry," Juniper said to the room in general. "I'll get a cloth for the candle wax." She went back to the service station. Her heart was doing the medical thing again. When Jerity left about 20 minutes later, he had the posture of a man who had come to some conclusions. Nikolai remained at the table, looking at his phone, and Juniper cleared the second setting. "That was fast," Nikolai said, without looking up. "Catching the glass? I've had a lot of practice catching things," Juniper said. "Mostly my own things, but the principal transfers." He looked up then, the grey eyes. "How much do they pay you here?" she told him. He said nothing for a moment. "That's not enough. Most things aren't," Juniper said, and then wanted to put herself in a bag and throw herself into Lake Michigan for saying something that, honest to a man she was increasingly failing to categorize correctly in her head. "Go home," Nikolai said, and placed a card on the table beside the standard envelope. "Call that number tomorrow, between 9 and 10. She looked at the card. It had a phone number and nothing else. "What is this for?" "A different job." She stood there with the cloth in her hand. "I don't think that's a good idea." He looked at her steadily. "Probably not," he agreed. "Call anyway." She called, obviously. She called at 9:17 because she spent 17 minutes sitting in her kitchen in her pajamas, having a conversation with herself about all the reasons this was inadvisable, and at some point during that conversation the number dialed itself. That was the story, she told herself, anyway. The voice that answered was not Nikolai. It was a woman, brisk and professional, who confirmed Juniper's name and told her she had an appointment at 11 a.m. the following Monday at an office on Michigan Avenue. The office was on the 38th floor of a building that was not as tall as the Vantage Tower, but was considerably more serious-looking. A receptionist who radiated the energy of someone who had signed multiple NDAs showed her into a glass-walled conference room and brought her coffee. 20 minutes later, a woman named Tatiana, who appeared to be around 50 and wore the kind of suit that communicated she had the authority to destroy you politely, walked in and explained the position. Juniper would be working as an executive assistant. The role involved calendar management, correspondence, invoice review, and general administrative coordination for several interlocking business interests. The salary was twice what she made at Aurelius. The benefits were extraordinary. There was a clothing allowance, which initially baffled her, and then made a certain logistical sense when she understood the scope of what calendar management meant. She was being offered a job managing the legitimate business side of Nikolai Sorokin's empire. She accepted before she had fully finished processing that sentence, which was maybe not her finest decision, but it was in the running. Her first day at the office, she broke the paper shredder. Not on purpose. She was feeding a document through, and the machine caught the edge of her sleeve. The new uniform was very slightly too large, because they'd had to order it from a different supplier, and the sizing ran inconsistent. And the gear mechanism made a sound like someone had put a stapler in a blender and seized completely. The document, which was a very routine contractor invoice and not anything sensitive, was immediately turned into a compact square of shredded confetti about the size of a deck of cards. Tatiana arrived at the doorway of the shredder room, which was adjacent to Juniper's desk, and looked at the machine. It jammed, Juniper said. Yes, Tatiana said. I can fix it. I'm good with machines, generally, in a broad sense. I'll call someone, Tatiana said, and left. Nikolai appeared in the doorway 3 minutes later, which she had not expected, because it was 9:15 a.m., and the level of the building he actually occupied was several floors above hers. He looked at the shredder. He looked at her. Good morning, Juniper said. What happened? There was a gear conflict. The sleeve was a contributing factor. She showed him the sleeve. It's fine. The document was routine. I've already restaged the relevant figures in the system. The originals are, she gestured at the confetti, archived. He looked at the confetti for a moment. Then he looked at her with that expression she was still learning to read. Not quite amusement, not quite assessment. Something between the two. The system you've already accessed, he said, slowly. Your filing taxonomy was intuitive once I understood the date-first convention. I reorganized the vendor subfolders by contract type. It's in the notes. You've been here 2 hours. I had coffee, Juniper said. I work fast when I have coffee. He said nothing for a moment. Don't touch the shredder again, agreed, and the third-floor filing room is now organized in a way that will take you 30% less time to locate historical contracts. I left a key for the system on your desk. Tatiana said you're usually in by 10. There was a long pause. How do you know what I'll want to find? Nikolai said. Juniper thought about how to answer that honestly. Because I've been reading the patterns in the business structure for 2 hours. You prioritize by origin date, not contract value, which means you're thinking historically, not just financially. The filing system before didn't reflect that. I fixed it. He looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly longer than comfortable. I'll have someone bring you a better coffee setup, he said, and went back upstairs. Within the month, things had shifted in the way that large things shift, slowly, and then all at once, so that by the time you noticed the change, it had already become the new normal. The men who worked on the floors between the legitimate offices and whatever happened above them had learned to say good morning to her. A man named Basha, who handled logistics, had started leaving pastries on her desk from a Polish bakery 3 blocks west, claiming they were extras from client meetings, and she suspected they were not. When she'd mentioned once that the office was cold in the mornings, the building's HVAC schedule had been adjusted by the following day. Nobody had told her this directly. It had simply happened. She knew what she was inside. She wasn't delusional. She read enough news to understand that Nikolai Sorokin's name appeared, periodically, in federal documents and investigative journalism pieces, in a way that suggested the government had significant professional interest in his activities. She knew the men who came to the upper floors were not consultants. She knew the shipments that passed through the freight interests she helped coordinate were not all lumber. She had made a choice. She had made it with her eyes open, which was the only way she knew how to make decisions, even bad ones. She just hadn't quite factored in the part where she developed feelings about it. It happened the way inconvenient things tend to happen, sideways, through a door you didn't know was open. She'd worked late on a Friday in October, cross-referencing a series of Port Authority logs that had inconsistencies she wanted to resolve before Monday, and Nikolai had still been in the building when she finished. He'd found her at her desk at 8:30 p.m. and not said anything for a moment, just looked at her with that measuring expression. You should go home, he said. I wanted to finish. It will be there Monday. I know. I wanted to finish anyway. He sat down, which surprised her. He never sat in the chair across from her desk. That was a guest chair, and he was not a guest. And he looked at the logs spread across her desk. Show me what you found. She showed him. The discrepancy was in a subsidiary carrier account, a pattern of micro-overages that averaged out to almost nothing individually, but compounded to a significant sum across 18 months. The same pattern, actually, as the Baltic shipping invoice she'd noticed at Aurelius, but in a different sector, which suggested either a systemic problem with one of his accounting vendors or something deliberate. Nikolai was very still while she explained this. "How long would this have continued?" he said when she finished. "If you hadn't found it?" "Indefinitely, probably. It's designed to look like rounding error. My accountants have reviewed these accounts 4 times in 18 months. I know. I saw the review timestamps. They were looking for large-scale irregularities. This is designed to evade that kind of review." He looked at her for a long moment. "Someone in my organization is stealing from me. Yes, you're not surprised." "No, why?" She thought about how to say this. "Because the person who set this up is smart, and smart people inside organizations know what the review process looks for. They engineer around it. The only way to catch it is to approach from a different angle." She paused. "I have a different angle generally. You have a different angle," he repeated quietly. "On most things." She wasn't sure what he meant by that, so she let it sit. He stayed for another hour, reviewing the documentation she'd compiled, and when he left, he stopped at the door and said, without turning around, "There's a car downstairs. It'll take you home. Don't take the train this late." "I take the train every night," Juniper said. "Not tonight," Nikolai said, and left. The car was there. She took it because it was October and raining, and her commute involved a transfer at Belmont that was never pleasant after dark. She told herself it was practical. She told herself that about a lot of things. 3 days later, on a grey Monday morning, Juniper arrived at the building to find that the usual lobby security personnel had been doubled. Taras was at the entrance. He nodded at her, which was normal. Then he fell into step beside her toward the elevator, which was not. "Is something happening?" she asked. "Upstairs will brief," Taras said, which was more words than he'd said to her collectively in the past month. Tatiana met her on her floor. The expression on Tatiana's face was the kind that had been practiced into neutrality and was not quite succeeding. "There's been a development," Tatiana said. "Mr. Sorokin would like you to remain on this floor today. Please do not go to the lobby, the parking structure, or any exterior-facing areas." Juniper processed this. "What kind of development?" "The kind we handle internally," Tatiana said, and left. She worked at her desk. She cross-referenced port data. She reorganized the Q3 subledgers. She drank 3 cups of coffee. At approximately 2 in the afternoon, she heard, from somewhere above her, a sound that was muffled by distance and architecture, but was unmistakably not a normal office noise. She stayed at her desk. At 4 p.m., Nikolai appeared at the door of her office. He was wearing the same suit as that morning, but the jacket was gone, and his sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and there was a look on his face that she recognized from the Thursday evenings when very bad meetings had occurred. "You're all right," she said, before she'd decided to say it. He stopped. "Yes. What happened?" "A disagreement between 2 parties with competing interests. In your building. It's been resolved." She looked at him for a moment. He had the controlled stillness of a man who was maintaining composure through technique. She'd seen it before on many Thursdays, but something was different tonight. Something closer to the surface. "Sit down," she said. He looked at the guest chair. "You've sat there before," she said. "On Friday. It survived." He sat. She got up and went to the coffee setup, the good one they'd brought her, with the proper Italian machine, and made him a cup she'd learned. He took it, without asking. She put it on the desk in front of him and went back to her chair. He looked at the coffee, then at her. "You're not going to ask. You'll tell me what you want me to know. That's not how most people operate." "I'm aware." He picked up the coffee. He drank it in silence for a moment. "The person overcharging on the freight accounts," he said finally. "It was a man named Drevko. He's been in my organization for 9 years." She waited. "He was also sharing information with a competing interest who has been trying to establish a foothold in the port operations." He was selling access. Nikolai set the cup down. He made a miscalculation about what I would do when I found out. People underestimate you, Juniper said, often. He looked at her. You don't. No. Why? She considered that honestly. Because I've been watching you on Thursday evenings for months, and you don't miss anything. People assume that calm means unaware. It doesn't. He was quiet for a moment. You've been watching me. She felt heat arrive in her face, professionally. In a professional capacity, it's called situational awareness. It's, Juniper, what? Stop. She stopped. He looked at her with the grey eyes, and this time the expression was completely readable, and she wished very much that it were not, because it was significantly easier to manage her internal situation when he was unreadable. You found the irregularity in the accounts, he said. Because of that, I found Drevko. Because of that, an information leak that could have caused significant damage to several operations has been closed. He paused. You protected something that matters to me, without being asked, without expecting anything for it. It was accounting, Juniper said. I was just doing my job. No, Nikolai said. You were doing considerably more than your job. You have been since the first night you spilled wine on me and then stood there and told me you would pawn a kidney for the dry cleaning bill. The almost smile appeared. I haven't forgotten that. I was panicking, Juniper said. I say strange things when I panic. I apologized to a lamppost once. I know, he said. Bogdan told me he was behind you. Oh, God! He thought it was, Nikolai paused, as if selecting the word carefully, charming. The office was quiet. The city outside the glass had gone to early evening, the light shifting to the blue-gray that Chicago wore in October like a uniform. This is a bad idea, Juniper said, because it seemed important to say. Yes, Nikolai agreed. I work for you. I work for, she gestured at the air, meaning the building, the floors above, all the things she didn't ask about. I know what you mean. And I spill things. I break shredders. I once knocked an entire condiment tray off a cart, and it hit a man in the shin, and he had to get 2 stitches. Juniper, I'm telling you this as full disclosure. I know who you are, Nikolai said. I have been watching you also, professionally. The word was deliberate, almost gentle. I know exactly who you are. She looked at him across the desk in the October light with the coffee between them. Okay, she said, not a capitulation, a choice, fully seen, fully made. He reached across the desk and covered her hand with his, a gesture so simple it felt like the opposite of everything else in the room, everything above them, everything that word, professionally, was carefully not saying. His hand was large and warm and had, she was fairly certain, done things she would never ask about and probably didn't want to know. She held very still. Tomorrow, he said, I would like you to look at the Q4 projections with me. There are discrepancies I want another angle on. I saw them, she said. I made notes. He didn't look surprised. Of course you did. She was still looking at their hands. This is still a bad idea, she said. Almost certainly, he said. I'm going to break something else eventually. You'll probably break several things, he said. I've budgeted for it. She laughed. A real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere that hadn't been touched by careful professionalism or strategic neutrality. He looked at her when she laughed with an expression that had nothing calculated in it at all. The month that followed was quieter. Not in the city. Chicago in November was not a quiet place, and the world above her floor continued to operate in its particular register of controlled danger. But in her orbit, specifically, there was a quality of steadiness she hadn't expected. Bogdan started bringing 2 pastries. Taras held the elevator. A woman she hadn't met before, who handled what she understood to be Nikolai's external communications, stopped by her office one afternoon and introduced herself as if they were both simply colleagues, which they were, in most of the ways that mattered. Nikolai appeared at her door most evenings, between 7 and 7:30, and they reviewed what needed reviewing, and sometimes they didn't review anything and just talked. about numbers and about Chicago winters and about the town in Ohio she'd grown up in, and the city in the East where he'd come from, which he described only in terms of its weather and its geometry, never its history, and she didn't ask about the history. She still knocked things over. She knocked a small cactus off his windowsill once, and it landed upright somehow, intact, and they both stared at it for a moment before she said, "I think we both know that shouldn't have worked," and he laughed. Not the rusty, unpracticed sound from the first night, but something easier now, something that fit in his chest better. She was in his world. She knew what that meant and what it didn't mean. She'd made the choice with her eyes open, which was the only kind she knew how to make. The night she knocked over the cactus, walking back from his office toward the elevator, she passed Bogdan in the hallway. He was holding a bakery bag. He stopped when he saw her face, whatever was in her expression that she hadn't quite managed to neutralize, and he looked at her for a moment in the careful, assessing way of a man who had watched a lot of situations develop. Then he held out the bakery bag. "From this morning," he said, "extra." She took it. She looked inside. There were 2 apple pastries from the Polish bakery, still warm. She looked up at Bogdan. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. "Good night, Miss Hadley." She rode the elevator down. The lobby had its usual evening security. Outside, Michigan Avenue moved in its continuous cold current of people and taxis and November wind off the lake. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment with the bakery bag, thinking about trajectories, the ones you planned and the ones that happened sideways, through a door you didn't know was open, because you caught your heel on an uneven floor and a bottle of $4,000 wine found its way, against all probability, to exactly the right place. She started walking. She did not take the train. There was a car at the curb, black, familiar, waiting without being called, because somewhere on the upper floors a man with grey eyes had thought about her commute and acted on it in the same quiet, absolute way he acted on everything. She got in. She thought, going to need a better way to carry the bakery bag, because her tendency to overfill her tote was going to send a pastry flying one of these mornings, and she would catch it or she wouldn't. And either way, Nikolai would find out, and he would say something dry and precise about it from across whatever room they were in. And she would laugh, the real laugh, the kind from somewhere untouched. And that, for now, was more than enough.